Hey everybody, Chris Armiger, Fort Myers Beach Fire Department. Uh, so for the case study for Chapter 6, Earthquakes and Volcanoes, I did Mount St. Helens, which was in Washington State in 1980. The reason I picked it was because, well, first of all, I was born in 1980, so it was just an odd coincidence that caught my eye. And so when I read the study, um, started watching some videos on YouTube and reading about it, like a couple articles and stuff. It was different than a lot of the other studies that we've done so far because they were a lot of them were like 100 years old, and it's really hard to visualize and kind of it's a little bit hard for me to see the reference and and make it relevant. So this one is very relevant. I can picture the time. I can not so much the place, but I can picture the era, the generation, the technology, and I have a good point of reference. So as I go through the study, um, I'll start at the very beginning. In this one, you're a county commissioner for the region, this mountainous region in Washington State, and it starts with it's March, so it's 2 months before the actual eruption, and you're informed by scientists, volcanologists, that there's been earthquakes up at the mountain, and that those earthquakes are signs of an impending eruption for the mountain. So what do you do? So this case study I liked a lot because there's a tremendous amount of planning that can be done and should have been done for this one because of the timeline. The caveat to that is, after watching a lot of these videos, is there was this particular incident generated a tremendous amount of scientific research and development and answers from those research methods that they apply today to predicting volcanoes. That they even in the short um, period, like months after the original eruption, they were able to start pinpointing preceding eruptions and flows and earthquakes around the mountain. From what I understand, it erupted in 80 was the big one. This May 18th in 1980, but it erupted continuously, certainly in smaller phases or smaller sessions, for 6 years. Uh, After this explosion, this was the most catastrophic. Um, so as we go through the case study, one of the things that I learned and I found very interesting was about the three different types of volcanoes and this composite volcano, or rather, this is a composite volcano, which is the most threatening because of the type of debris, the size of the debris, and just the violence of the explosion. What I have found astounding was that there's a part of the videos, and I think I put the link down below this. There's a reference to, like, in some time period between like 5 to 9 minutes after the initial eruption of the north side of the mountain, there was complete decimation of any living organism, like no exaggeration, bacteria, like nothing, nothing survived for 230 square miles, and that happened, like I said, within they speculate the time frame from 5 to 9 minutes, less than 10 minutes. In less than 10 minutes, 230 square miles, every living organism down to bacteria, just gone. Um, as an emergency planner, emergency manager working for FEMA, insurance companies, whatever your role might be, from this case study, one of the big takeaways for me was trying to proactively plan and mitigate a scenario when you can't really identify the threat. So earthquakes, you can plan for an earthquake and you don't really know when it's going to come, but you can predict the event. There's short, devastating events in most circumstances. You can plan for 9.1s and 9.5s and 10s and all this other stuff. You can plan for the most catastrophic incident, but you have a realistic timeline of what the incident's going to be. And based on stuff you find in GIS, what is in a particular, geographical confine, you can plan for damages. An earthquake in San Francisco that has an initial quake of 3 to 5 minutes, and then tertiary quakes maybe for a day or two that are small, one, twos, and threes. That you can realistically predict the kind of damage, and um, resources you're going to need to respond to that. But with the volcanic eruption, you're dealing with earthquakes. You don't know how long it's going to last for, and it's really impossible to predict the debris field and the impact because you can't predict the size of the explosion and all these other sort of things. You can kind of, nowadays, you can predict times and you can estimate intensity of explosions, but then you couldn't. A lot of that data came from this incident. There's a picture I included in my post, and like the debris field, so you had the devastating one for 230 square miles, but it literally, the ash spread like to the middle of the country, to the Midwest, to the Bible Belt of the U.S. So you just have this immense field. Even when we talk about hurricanes, a hurricane might impact the whole East Coast, but it's for like, 50, maybe to exaggerate, 100 miles from the shoreline inland. And it might roll up from Jacksonville or the Carolinas all the way up to, Maryland or something like that, up into the Chesapeake, maybe a little bit further, but usually not. But you have, the incident, you have usually a couple weeks to prepare. You have the incident, which might impact your community or your jurisdiction for, a day at most, and then you have the flooding for maybe a week or two, and then that's it, and then it's the rebuild phase. But this thing with Mount St. Helens was catastrophic for generations. That land, there was virgin forest that was destroyed, that took thousands of years to grow and flourish. You consider the impact to the natural vegetation, to the wildlife, and then a big thing that I've been learning to kind of cue on, that's really interested me, especially going through these case studies in emergency management and all, is like, how do you get money? How do you plan for this? How do you budget and get the resources you need? It all comes down to money at the end of the day. And you have this industry that they mentioned in here, the forestry industry. And, to get mitigation, to get buy-in, to get private industry to do what they need to do. So you come up with a mitigation plan, a disaster plan. Hey, we need to have, what's the big priority in this one is evacuation routes, because you don't know when you're going to have to evacuate, but you know that when you decide to evacuate, it's going to have to be a lot in a short amount of time. And the evacuation is constantly it may constantly change. Same thing like a hurricane where, all right, we think it's coming up, the spaghetti plots. We think it's coming up the East Coast. Wait, now it's going to the Gulf and it's coming up the West Coast. And, so where do I go? Do I evacuate to Fort Lauderdale, or do I go to Fort Myers, or do I go to, Georgia, or do I have to go to Mississippi, or, so if it goes to the Gulf or it goes to the Atlantic, that's kind of like your variable. But with this thing, like I said, 230 square miles gone. The top 1,000 feet of Mount St. Helens disappeared. And then you have this ash cloud that goes across, 8 different states to the center of the country. So you have to have an evacuation plan that you can enact quickly to evacuate people from the immediate area, of danger when you have the initial eruption. But then we're talking like months of people being displaced because of health reasons and really because of finances, because of business. You can't operate business in communities like this that have, if the forestry industry is the industry for that community, for that county, or perhaps even for the state, you've got hundreds, if not thousands of people with no source of revenue, no income. Their whole family's going to be displaced. And you're going to have to figure out a way, maybe not as a local emergency manager, but up at the FEMA level, at the national level, the federal level, how do we transplant entire communities? So to bring it back, like the mitigation part early on, that needs to be part of the plan, are these financial considerations. So when you are soliciting for resources and to get buy-in from the private industries, that's the avenue to pursue, is, hey, you guys need to, whatever, provide these sort of resources, provide these sort of grade of shelters, or have these sort of evacuation plans in place, and whatever other things you might identify to avoid that kind of catastrophic failure or risk to the community. The only other thing that really stood out to me with this also was like obviously the health issues. So there's going to be long-term health issues involved with an incident like this. There's going to be obviously immediate ones, but then also long-term ones, kind of like the stuff we see to make it relevant to today, like with 9/11, like the exposure to the dust and all the respiratory issues that are going to come from people working in these sort of environments, because you're breathing all that fine dust. So, it's estimated that one of the videos I saw that this was like hundreds of millions of dollars of damage, and over a 30-year period, it probably is one of, if not the most costly natural event in history, if you really think about it. So either way, I know I'm going kind of long, so I'm going to wrap it up and start watching some videos and do my replies. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys around.